Four brothers stood frozen in the Montana blizzard, staring at the stagecoach that had just shattered every plan they'd made. They'd ordered 3 mail-order brides to save their dying ranch. Instead, 4 Chinese sisters stepped into the snow, proud, unafraid, and refusing to be separated. Behind them, a ruthless businessman had forged documents claiming ownership of their very lives. The sisters had one demand: they stay together or they don't stay at all. In that moment, with the wind howling and the future hanging by a thread, the oldest brother had to make an impossible choice. If you're ready for a story of courage, survival, and unexpected love on the American frontier, stay with me until the end. And please, like this video and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth. Silas Carter stood at the window of the stage station, watching the storm devour the landscape. Snow fell so thick, it turned the world into nothing but white noise and shadow. Behind him, his 3 younger brothers sat in various states of nervous energy. Rowan pacing near the stove, Elias staring into his coffee cup like it held answers, and Luke whittling a piece of wood into splinters with hands that wouldn't stay still. "Should have been here 2 hours ago," Rowan muttered, making his 5th trip past the same floorboards. At 28, he was built like a man who'd spent his life wrestling cattle and landscape into submission. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a jaw that rarely relaxed. "Stage don't run this late unless something's wrong." "Storm's wrong enough," Silas said, without turning from the window. At 32, he carried the weight of being the oldest the way some men carried scars, visible in the set of his shoulders, the lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words. "They'll come. Driver knows these routes better than we know our own fence lines." "Unless they turn back," Luke offered. At 23, he was the youngest, still lean where his brothers had filled out, still quick to smile even when worry pulled at the corners of his mouth. Might have decided waiting out the storm made more sense than pushing through it. They didn't turn back. Elias spoke quietly from his corner, the way he did most things. At 26, he existed somewhere between his brothers in age and temperament, thoughtful where Rowan was restless, grounded where Luke was optimistic. They've got passengers depending on them, same as we've got people depending on us making this work. The silence that followed held the weight of everything they weren't saying. The Carter Ranch sprawled across 800 acres of Montana territory that had been beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Their father had claimed it 15 years ago, carved a life out of grass and sky and stubborn determination. When fever took both parents 3 winters back, Silas had inherited not just land but the crushing responsibility of keeping it alive. They'd tried. Lord knew they'd tried. But a ranch this size needed more than 4 men. It needed families. It needed women who could turn a house into a home, who could help build something that lasted beyond the next season's cattle drive. It needed a future that looked like more than 4 brothers growing old in silence. So Silas had done what desperate men did on the frontier. He'd written letters, placed advertisements, made promises about land and stability to women he'd never met, in cities he'd never seen. 3 women had answered. 3 mail-order brides willing to travel west, to marry strangers, to build new lives in a place most people only pass through on their way to somewhere else. Sarah Mitchell from Boston, a widow with schoolteacher credentials and a crisp, efficient handwriting that suggested someone who valued order. Catherine O'Brien from Philadelphia, the daughter of Irish immigrants who wrote about wanting land her family could actually own. Mary Schmidt from Baltimore, a baker's daughter whose letters smelled like cinnamon and whose sentences ran together with enthusiasm that barely fit on the page. 3 women. 3 brothers to marry them, Rowan, Elias, and Luke. Silas had insisted he didn't need a wife, that someone had to keep perspective, maintain the practical arrangements of what this was. A business agreement dressed up in wedding vows. His brothers had called him a coward, but they'd accepted his logic, mostly because they knew he was right. Someone had to keep their heads clear while everyone else tried to navigate the impossible awkwardness of arranged frontier marriages. "Horses," Rowan said sharply, his hand already on the door. "I hear horses." They all moved at once, pulling on coats, stepping out into the storm that hit like a physical force. Snow stung exposed skin, wind tried to shove them backward, cold sank claws in deep enough to ache. But through the white chaos, shapes emerged. Horses. A stagecoach. Movement. The driver climbed down, snow already coating his hat and shoulders. "Got your delivery, Carter," he shouted over the wind. "Though I gotta say, this ain't exactly what I was expecting to haul through a blizzard." Something in his tone made Silas's chest tighten. "The women, are they all right?" "Women are fine, just you might want to brace yourself." The coach door swung open. The first woman who stepped down into the snow made Silas forget about the cold. She was Chinese, small-framed, but carrying herself with a posture that suggested steel beneath silk. Her dark hair was pulled back in an intricate style that the wind immediately attacked, sending strands across a face that betrayed no emotion, not fear, not uncertainty, not the exhaustion that had to be dragging at her after days of travel. She wore a heavy coat over what looked like traditional Chinese clothing, practical boots showing beneath embroidered fabric. When her eyes met Silas's, they were absolutely steady. "I am Meilin," she said, her English careful but clear. "These are my sisters." 3 more women emerged from the coach. The second carried the same delicate build, but with an energy that seemed barely contained, eyes that darted everywhere, taking in the station, the brothers, the storm, with quick, assessing glances. She moved like someone ready to fight or run at a moment's notice. The third was slender and quiet, clutching what looked like a wrapped bundle to her chest with protective care. She kept her gaze down, but Silas saw her fingers, paint-stained, he realized with surprise. The fourth was younger than the rest, probably no more than 18 or 19. Where the others showed caution or control, she radiated something closer to determination mixed with barely suppressed nervousness. 4 women. 4 Chinese sisters. Not a widow from Boston or a baker's daughter from Baltimore anywhere in sight. "There's been some kind of mistake," Rowan said, finding his voice first. We were expecting..." 3 women, Meilin finished for him. "Yes, we know." Her gaze swept across all 4 brothers, and Silas had the distinct impression of being measured and catalogued. "The women you expected did not come. We came instead." "Why?" The question came out harder than Silas intended, but nothing about this made sense. "How did you even know about..." "We were at the agency," the second sister interrupted, her English faster and more colloquial than Meilin's. "In San Francisco, when your letters arrived. The other women, they heard talk. About Chinese. About how some towns out here don't want us. How some men think we're not good enough for..." She bit off the words, jaw tight. "Suyin," Meilin said quietly, a gentle warning. "They're going to find out anyway," Suyin shot back. "Better they know now." She turned back to the brothers, chin lifted in defiance. "The women you wanted heard rumors about anti-Chinese sentiment in Montana. They got scared. Decided marrying strangers out here wasn't worth the risk if the strangers might turn on them for having Chinese neighbors." "That's ridiculous," Luke said immediately. "We don't care about... We just need..." He stopped, seeming to realize how that sounded. "You need wives," Meilin said simply, "and we need..." She paused, something flickering across her composed expression. "We need what you offered. Land, distance, a new beginning." 4 of you, Elias said, speaking for the first time since the women arrived. "But there's only 3. We stay together." Meilin's voice didn't rise, but it carried absolute conviction. "This is not negotiable. Either you take all 4 of us, or we return to San Francisco on the next stage." The wind howled into the silence that followed. Snow accumulated on shoulders, on hats, on the ground between them, a physical reminder that decisions made standing in blizzards had consequences. Silas looked at his brothers. Rowan wore confusion and frustration in equal measure. Elias showed careful consideration. Luke looked between the women and his brothers with something like distressed hope. None of them had signed up for this. None of them had prepared for Chinese sisters instead of American widows and bakers' daughters. None of them had expected to be standing in a snowstorm trying to figure out how to fit 4 women into a plan designed for 3. But the alternative was sending them back, returning to a ranch that felt more like a graveyard for hopes with each passing season. Watching the dream of building something lasting die a little more completely. Silas studied Meilin's face, the determination there, the pride, the carefully controlled desperation underneath. Whatever had driven these women to travel across an ocean and half a continent, it wasn't simple adventure. People didn't upend entire lives and risk everything on strangers without running from something worse. The ranch can support 4 families, he said slowly. That was always the plan, eventually. I just figured I'd wait, let my brothers settle first. He met Maylene's eyes. You need distance from something. We need help building a future. Maybe those needs line up better than any of us expected. Silas, Rowan started, uncertainty thick in his voice. You got a better idea? Silas asked. Because I'm fresh out. Stage driver needs to get moving before the storm gets worse, which means we decide now. Do we send 4 women back into whatever they're running from, or do we figure out how to make this work? Maylene tilted her head slightly, studying him with new attention. You do not know us, our customs, our language, our ways. We are strangers in every sense that matters. So we're Sarah and Catherine and Mary, Silas pointed out. Letters don't make people known. They just make them less strange than complete silence. A small smile touched the corner of Maylene's mouth. There and gone so quickly, Silas almost missed it. She turned, speaking rapid Chinese to her sisters. The second sister, Suyin, responded with what sounded like arguments. The quiet one with the bundle said something soft. The youngest nodded enthusiastically. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like watching something essential being negotiated in a language Silas couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Maylene turned back. We accept your offer under the original terms. 4 marriages, equal partnerships. We will work. We will help build your ranch. We will honor the agreements made. She paused. But we will also keep our names, our traditions, and our connection as sisters. These things are not negotiable. Wouldn't ask them to be, Silas said. He looked at the stage driver. How much do we owe you for the extra passenger? Already paid, the driver said, climbing back up to his seat. Agency settled the accounts before we left. You folks figure out the rest on your own time. I got a storm to beat. He tipped his hat. Good luck. You're all going to need it. The stagecoach pulled away, taking with it the last easy option for anyone to change their minds. The 8 of them stood in the snow, strangers bound by desperate choices and legal documents that suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Right, Silas said, forcing practicality through his shock. Introductions. Then we get inside before someone loses fingers to frostbite. I'm Silas Carter. That's Rowan, Elias, and Luke. Maylene, the first sister said again. 28 years, the oldest. She gestured to each sister in turn. Suyin, 26. Jia, 24. Lilin, 19. The names felt unfamiliar in Silas's ears, but he committed them to memory the way he'd learned to remember cattle brands and fence locations, essential information for survival. The ranch is 12 miles northwest, he continued. We've got a wagon. Normally we'd all ride, but given the storm and the luggage, I can ride, Suyin said immediately. Don't need a wagon. Rowan raised an eyebrow. In this weather? Ma'am, I don't think... I've ridden through worse. Something in Suyin's stance suggested this wasn't bravado but simple fact. We could all ride, Lilene offered, her English slower and more accented than her sister's. If it helps move faster. Gia gets sick in wagons, Maylene said quietly. The rocking motion. Horses would be better, if possible. Silas looked at his brothers again. Rowan shrugged. Elias nodded slightly. Luke was already moving toward the stable. Horses it is, Silas decided. Luke, get the mounts ready. Rowan, help with the luggage. Elias, I'll make sure everyone's dressed warm enough, Elias finished, already assessing the women's coats with the practical eye of someone who'd seen frostbite take fingers and toes. They moved into action with the efficient coordination of men who'd worked together their entire lives. Within 20 minutes, 8 horses stood ready, luggage secured, everyone bundled against a storm that showed no signs of relenting. Maylene swung into her saddle with practiced grace that surprised Silas. So did Suyin. Even Gia, who'd seemed so nervous and withdrawn, settled onto her horse with comfortable familiarity. You've all ridden before, Rowan observed, sounding both relieved and puzzled. Our father had horses, Maylene said, in China, before... She didn't finish the sentence, but shadows crossed her face. Before whatever drove them here, Silas filled in silently. Before whatever made four sisters cross an ocean to marry strangers in a land where people might hate them just for existing. "Stay close," he said, instead of prying. "Storm's only getting worse, and these trails get treacherous in the snow. We lose each other. It could be hours before we reconnect." "Or days," Rowan added grimly. "Or never. So nobody plays hero. We stick together, we move careful, we all make it home alive." They rode out into the white chaos. The wind tried to shred them apart immediately. Snow came at them horizontally, each flake feeling like a tiny blade against exposed skin. The horses moved carefully, testing each step, trusting instinct and their riders to guide them through landscape erased by weather. Silas rode point, following trails he knew by memory more than sight. Behind him, he heard Rowan calling out encouragement, Luke's voice cutting through the wind with directions, Elias's steady presence bringing up the rear to make sure nobody fell behind. And between them, four women who'd agreed to marry strangers rode through a Montana blizzard toward a future none of them could have imagined a week ago. An hour into the journey, Gia's horse stumbled. Elias was there before Silas even fully registered what had happened, his mount pressing close to steady the nervous animal, his gloved hand reaching out to catch Gia's reins. "Easy," Elias called, his voice cutting through the storm without shouting. "Just a snowdrift. We're okay. Everybody's okay." Gia looked at him, eyes wide with something between fear and gratitude. She nodded once, fingers tight on the reins, then straightened her shoulders and urged her horse forward. They kept moving. 2 hours in, Lileen started laughing. It was so unexpected, so wildly out of place in the middle of a blizzard that everyone turned to look at her. "I'm sorry," she gasped, still giggling. We crossed an ocean, traveled for weeks, came all this way, and now we're going to die in a snowstorm before we even see the ranch we're supposed to be saving." "We're not dying," Luke said immediately, moving his horse closer to hers. "I promise. Silas knows these trails like his own heartbeat. We're maybe another hour out." "Maybe?" Lileen echoed, but she was still smiling. "Definitely," Luke corrected, smiling back. "Definitely another hour. Then hot food, warm beds, and shelter from all this. And then tomorrow, we figure out how to navigate the fact that we're all married to complete strangers," Suyin called from her position near Rowan. "One disaster at a time," Rowan replied, but there was something almost like humor in his voice. 3 hours after leaving the station, Silas spotted the first fence posts, ghostly shapes emerging from the white, marking the boundaries of Carter land. "Almost home," he called back. "Another 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt longer than the previous 3 hours combined. Now that safety was close, the cold seemed sharper, the exhaustion heavier, the absolute insanity of what they'd all agreed to more impossible to ignore. But then the ranch house materialized out of the storm, a 2-story structure that Silas's father had built to house generations. Barns and outbuildings formed protective barriers against the wind. Smoke rose from chimneys, promising heat and shelter. They stumbled into the barn together, 8 half-frozen people and 8 exhausted horses. The animals were seen to first, unsaddled, brushed down, fed, and watered. Then, finally, the humans could think about their own needs. In the lamplight of the barn, with the storm raging outside and relative safety achieved, Silas got his first clear look at the women his brothers had just agreed to marry. Maylin stood with her sisters gathered close, all 4 of them supporting each other while trying to appear strong. Snow melted in their hair, dripped from their coats. They were soaked and shivering and probably wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. But they were alive, they'd made it, and whatever came next, they'd face it under a roof instead of in a blizzard. "Welcome to the Carter Ranch," Silas said quietly. Maylene met his eyes. "Thank you for not sending us back. Thank you for being crazy enough to come." He gestured toward the house. "Let's get everyone warm and fed. The rest of it, the marriages, the arrangements, all of it, can wait until morning." They trudged through snow to the main house, a structure that had always felt too big for 4 men and suddenly seemed barely adequate for 8 people. Inside, Rowan immediately moved to build up the fires. Luke started pulling out blankets. Elias disappeared into the kitchen, returning with bread and cheese and dried meat, simple food, but enough to take the edge off hunger. The 4 sisters stood in the main room, taking in their surroundings with careful eyes. Silas saw what they must be seeing, a house that was clean but sparse, functional but lonely, furniture built for durability over comfort, walls bare of decoration, floors that echoed, a place that had been existing rather than living. "It's not much," Silas started. "It's more than we had," Maylene interrupted softly. "It's safe. It's shelter. It's a beginning." She looked at her sisters, then back at Silas. "That's enough." They ate in near silence, too tired for conversation, too overwhelmed for planning. When the food was gone, the question of sleeping arrangements loomed. "We've got 4 bedrooms upstairs," Silas said, navigating what felt like a minefield of propriety and practicality. "Figured tonight, you all take them. We'll sleep down here by the fires." "That's not fair," Liling protested. "You shouldn't have to—" "Tonight we should," Luke said gently. "Let everyone rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." The sisters looked at Maylene, waiting for her decision. She studied the brothers for a long moment, then nodded. "We accept. Thank you." They climbed the stairs together, 4 women disappearing into rooms that hadn't held female occupants since the brothers' mother died. Doors closed softly. Footsteps creaked overhead. Then silence. Silas and his brothers stood in the main room, looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shell-shocked to bewildered. "Well," Rowan said finally, "that happened." 4 Chinese sisters, Luke added, sounding dazed. "We just agreed to marry 4 Chinese sisters we met 3 hours ago in a blizzard." "We agreed to marry 4 women we'd never met," Elias pointed out. "The Chinese part is just another detail." "A pretty significant detail," Rowan muttered. "People in town, some of them aren't going to be happy about this." "People in town can mind their own business," Silas said sharply. "We made a deal. Those women traveled halfway around the world on the promise of marriages and land. We're not backing out because of small-minded gossip." "I'm not saying we should," Rowan defended. "I'm just saying it's going to be complicated." "Everything about this is complicated," Silas agreed. "But we've handled worse. We'll handle this too." They settled down by the fires, wrapping themselves in blankets, trying to find comfortable positions on floors they'd slept on before during bitter winters, or when illness had made the bedrooms unusable. But sleep didn't come easy. Silas lay awake, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds of the house settling. Overhead, he heard soft footsteps, low voices speaking in Chinese, the creak of bed frames as exhausted women finally found rest. 4 strangers were sleeping in his house. 4 women who'd trusted legal documents and desperate hope enough to travel to the far edge of the frontier. 4 lives now tangled with his family's future in ways he couldn't begin to map. He thought about Maylene's eyes, the strength there, the pain carefully hidden beneath composure. He thought about Suyan's defiance, Jia's quiet grace, Liling's nervous determination. They were brave, possibly crazy, but definitely brave. And whatever had happened in their past, whatever they were running from, it had to be terrible to make this seem like the better option. The storm raged through the night. Inside the Carter ranch house, 8 people tried to sleep through the knowledge that their lives had just changed in ways none of them could predict or control. By morning, the world would be buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, and 4 marriages would need to be navigated by people who barely spoke the same language and definitely didn't understand each other's worlds. But tonight, in the darkness and the cold and the uncertain shelter of a frontier ranch, they were all just survivors who'd made it through a blizzard. Everything else could wait for dawn. Upstairs, Maylene stood at the window of her room, watching snow fall through darkness. Behind her, she could hear her sisters settling into the other bedrooms. Suyan's restless movements, Jia's soft breathing, Liling's whispered prayers. They'd made it. Against every odd, every obstacle, every moment of doubt and terror during their flight from San Francisco and the man who'd claimed to own them, they'd made it to Montana, to a ranch at the edge of the world, to men who'd agreed to marriages without even knowing who they were marrying. Men who could have sent them back, should have sent them back by any logical measure. But Silas Carter had looked at her, really looked, seen past the shock and the cultural divide and the complication, and chosen to take a chance on strangers. She didn't know if that made him brave or foolish, probably both. Her hand drifted to the small bundle she'd carried all the way from China, through San Francisco, through the stage journey and the blizzard ride. letters, documents, proof of the debts her father had accumulated before his death, the forged contracts that gave a ruthless businessman legal claim to 4 daughters as settlement, papers that said Victor Blackthorne owned them, papers they'd fled across an ocean and half a continent to escape, papers that haunted every decision, every plan, every desperate choice that led them to this remote Montana ranch. Maylene pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching snow erase the landscape. Out there, somewhere in the vast American frontier, Blackthorne was hunting them. She knew it the way she knew winter followed autumn, the way she knew debts collected eventually. Men like him didn't give up what they considered property. But maybe, just maybe, they'd bought enough distance. Maybe 4 marriages to American ranchers would create enough legal protection. Maybe the sheer remoteness of this place would make them not worth finding. Maybe they could finally be safe. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, steadying herself against hope that felt as dangerous as despair. Tomorrow, she would start building the life they'd risked everything to claim. She would learn this house, these men, this brutal, beautiful landscape. She would be the perfect wife, the valuable partner, the woman worth keeping. She would make herself indispensable. Because being sent back wasn't an option. Going back meant Victor Blackthorne. Going back meant losing everything: freedom, family, future. Going back meant death, in every way that mattered. So she would make this work. Whatever it took, however hard it became. They all would. The storm howled, snow fell, and in a ranch house at the edge of the Montana frontier, 8 strangers slept through the last night before their lives became irrevocably tangled together. Outside, the land dreamed under winter's heavy blanket. Inside, futures hung in the balance of promises made by desperate people in desperate times. And somewhere in the distance, a man who believed he owned 4 Chinese sisters began making plans to collect what he considered his property. But that storm was still days away from arriving. Tonight, there was only snow and silence, and the fragile shelter of hope against the cold. Dawn broke cold and clean, sunlight catching on snow that had transformed the ranch into something from a dream. Silas woke to silence, the kind that only came after storms, when the world held its breath before remembering how to move again. His brothers were already stirring, bodies stiff from sleeping on hard floors, breath misting in air that had grown cold overnight as the fires burned down to embers. Rowan stood at the window, looking out at drifts that reached halfway up the barn doors. Elias was rebuilding the fire with quiet efficiency. Luke stretched, joints popping, and headed toward the kitchen. "Coffee first," Luke muttered. "Then we figure out what happens next." What happened next came down the stairs 20 minutes later. The 4 sisters descended together, moving with the same unified caution they'd shown the night before. In daylight, without the distortion of storm and exhaustion, Silas saw details he'd missed. The careful mending on Suyan's sleeve, the paint stains on Gia's fingers that no amount of washing had fully removed, the way Lilene stayed close to Maylene like a shadow seeking shelter. Maylene had changed from her travel-stained clothes into a simple dress of deep blue, her hair pulled back with the same meticulous care she seemed to apply to everything. When her eyes met Silas's across the room, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the impossible situation they were all navigating. "Good morning," she said formally. "We did not wish to intrude, but we heard movement." "It's your house too now," Silas replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Technically, as of last night, legally. He gestured to the kitchen where Luke was already setting out cups. "Coffee's almost ready. Breakfast after that. Then we need to talk about arrangements." They gathered around a table that had been built to seat a large family, but had only ever held 4 men. Now it felt almost crowded, knees nearly touching, personal space compressed in ways that made everyone acutely aware of proximity. Luke poured coffee with the concentration of someone grateful for a task. Elias sliced bread. Rowan found the butter and jam their mother had taught them to make summers ago, before everything changed. The sisters watched this domestic choreography with careful attention, and Silas realized they were learning, cataloging where things were kept, how the kitchen functioned, mapping the geography of their new home. "The storm dropped 2 feet, Rowan said, breaking the silence that had grown awkward. "Maybe more in the drifts. We'll need to dig out the barn doors, check on the cattle, make sure nothing collapsed under the weight." "We can help," Suyan said immediately. Rowan blinked. "Ma'am, that's heavy work. We don't expect—" "We are not delicate," Suyan interrupted, her accent sharpening with irritation. We have hands. We can shovel snow. I didn't mean, Rowan stopped, clearly out of his depth. I just thought, you thought we would stay inside and do women's work while you did men's work, Maylene finished calmly. This is understandable. It is what you know. But we are not what you know. She set down her coffee cup with precise care. We will learn your ranch. We will work. This was the agreement. Partnerships, not decorations. Silas found himself fighting a smile. Fair enough. But everyone needs to understand the work first. This isn't about capability. It's about not getting hurt doing unfamiliar tasks in dangerous conditions. So teach us, Laeline said softly. We learn fast. The brothers exchanged glances. Finally, Elias nodded. All right. After breakfast, we divide tasks. Some dig out, some check the animals, some make sure the house stays warm and everyone stays fed. We rotate so everyone learns everything. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which probably meant it was fair. They ate quickly, fueling bodies for hard work ahead. Then they bundled into coats and boots, redistributing clothing so everyone had adequate protection against cold that could kill careless people in minutes. Outside, the world was blinding white and impossibly beautiful. Snow stretched in pristine drifts, unmarked except for the tracks of animals that had ventured out in the night. The sky arced overhead in crystalline blue, the kind of clarity that only came after storms washed the air clean. Stay together, Silas instructed. Snow this deep hides hazards, frozen creek beds, fence posts, debris. Step wrong and you could break an ankle or worse. They moved as a group toward the barn, wading through snow that reached mid-thigh in places. Rowan and Luke took the lead, breaking trail. The sisters followed, with Elias and Silas bringing up the rear. Halfway there, Gia stumbled. Elias caught her before she fell, his hand steadying her elbows, his voice low and reassuring. Easy. There's a rock there. Can't see it under the snow, but I should have warned you. My fault. Gia looked up at him, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude that someone had claimed responsibility instead of blaming her clumsiness. Thank you, she said quietly. Any time. Elias released her carefully, making sure she had her balance before stepping back. They reached the barn to find the doors completely blocked. It took 30 minutes of hard shoveling to clear enough space to get inside, everyone taking turns with the tools, learning the rhythm of work that was familiar to some and foreign to others. Inside the barn, the cattle were restless but alive, their breath steaming in the cold air. The horses whickered recognition at the brothers, then turned curious eyes on the women. They need water and feed, Rowan explained, already moving toward the storage area. We keep supplies here for times we get snowed in. Should have enough to last a week, maybe more. Show me, Suyin said, following him. Rowan looked at her, really looked, seeing past the small frame to the determination underneath. All right, but if a horse spooks, you step back. They're good animals, but they're big and they can hurt you without meaning to. I know horses, Suyin replied. I told you, my father had them. Then you know to respect them, Rowan said. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. They worked through the morning, establishing patterns that would become routines. Maylene gravitated toward the house, but not in the way Silas expected. She moved through the kitchen with the focus of someone conducting reconnaissance, opening cabinets, checking supplies, mentally cataloging what existed and what was needed. Your stores are adequate but poorly organized, she observed when Silas came in for water. And you are low on vegetables that keep. Potatoes, turnips, carrots. Winter this harsh. You need more. We make do, Silas said, slightly defensive. Making do is not the same as thriving. Maylene pulled out a sack of flour, examined it, set it aside. When the weather clears, you go to town, yes? For supplies? Usually, though with the snow this deep might be a week or more. Then we work with what we have. I can make stores stretch further, feed everyone better. She glanced at him. This is my skill. Let me use it. It wasn't really a question, but Silas nodded anyway. Kitchen's yours. Just tell us what you need. Over the next week, the ranch transformed in ways subtle and profound. Maylene took over the kitchen completely, reorganizing with an efficiency that was almost aggressive. Meals that had been functional became substantial, bread that actually tasted like something other than dense survival, stews that had depth and complexity, even coffee that somehow improved despite being the same beans they'd always used. "She's a miracle worker," Luke declared on the third day, scraping his bowl clean. "Or a witch. I'm not ruling out witch." Suyin, meanwhile, had essentially challenged Rowan to a competition neither of them had officially declared. She rode with him to check fence lines, worked beside him mucking stalls, matched him task for task with stubborn determination. "She's going to hurt herself," Rowan muttered to Silas, after Suyin had spent 4 hours helping repair a section of fence damaged by the storm's weight. "Has she?" Silas asked. "No, but then maybe give her credit for knowing her limits." Rowan scowled but said nothing, which meant Silas had won that argument. Elias and Gia had fallen into a different pattern, quieter, less confrontational. Gia spent hours in a corner of the main room that caught good light, working on paintings she created from memory and imagination. Elias would find excuses to be nearby, mending tack or reading, their silence companionable rather than awkward. One evening, Silas found Elias studying one of Gia's paintings, a landscape of mountains that definitely weren't Montana, rendered in delicate brushstrokes that suggested homesickness and artistry in equal measure. "She's talented," Silas observed. "She's incredible," Elias corrected. "These aren't just pictures, they're memories, stories. She's painting her whole life, trying to hold on to it before it fades." "You asked her about them?" "She offered to explain. I asked to listen." Elias touched the edge of the canvas carefully, reverent. "She had a good life before. Family, beauty, purpose. Then her father died, and everything collapsed. It was the most information any of them had gotten about the sisters' past, and Silas filed it away carefully. Luke and Liling, meanwhile, had become the ranch's unexpected source of lightness. Liling laughed easily and often, finding humor in her mistakes and joy in small victories. Luke responded to her energy like a plant to sunlight, his natural optimism amplified by someone who matched it. "They're good for each other," Maylene said one evening, watching Luke teach Liling to play cards while Liling taught him words in Chinese. "They're young," Silas replied. "Young is not the same as foolish. Sometimes it is exactly what is needed." Maylene was kneading dough, her hands working with practiced rhythm. "Luke makes my sister remember how to hope. Liling makes your brother remember how to play. These are not small gifts." Silas couldn't argue with that. The marriages themselves remained unconsummated, undefined, existing in a strange liminal space between legal contract and actual relationship. The sisters kept to their separate rooms upstairs. The brothers maintained their sleeping arrangements by the fires. It was an arrangement that couldn't last indefinitely, but no one seemed ready to address it directly. Until the night Rowan and Suyin's competitive tension finally broke. It started over something trivial, an argument about the best way to break ice in the water troughs. Suyin insisted her method was more efficient. Rowan argued his prevented damage to the troughs themselves. The disagreement escalated from professional to personal with the speed of a match catching tinder. "You treat me like I am helpless," Suyin snapped, her accent thickening with anger. "I treat you like you've been here a week," Rowan shot back. "This ranch has rules that work. I'm not changing them because you think you know better." "I do not think. I know. You are stubborn and proud and too stupid to see when someone has a good idea. And you're reckless and argumentative and determined to prove something that nobody's questioning." They stood in the barn, facing each other like fighters in a ring, both breathing hard, both furious. Then Suyin laughed, a sharp, bright sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "You are impossible," she said, but she was smiling. "You're infuriating," Rowan replied, but his mouth was twitching toward a grin. "We are both terrible at this. Absolutely awful." They stared at each other for another moment. Then Rowan shook his head. "How about we try your way tomorrow, see if it works? If it does, we change the method. If it doesn't, you admit I was right. And if it works better than your way, you admit I was right. Deal." They shook hands on it, a gesture that lingered slightly too long to be purely professional. Silas, watching from the barn door, decided discretion was the better part of valor and quietly retreated. The next morning, Suyin's method worked flawlessly. Rowan admitted defeat with surprising grace, and something shifted between them, rivalry transmuting into something that might eventually become respect, partnership, possibly more. 2 weeks after the sisters arrived, the weather finally cleared enough for a trip to town. Silas had been delaying, knowing the reception wouldn't be entirely friendly, but supplies were genuinely running low on things Maylene couldn't improvise. "I'll go," he announced at breakfast. "Anyone else need to come? Speak now." "I will accompany you," Maylene said immediately. "I should see the town, meet the merchants, understand what is available." "Maylene, people in town, some of them might not be welcoming." "I have experienced unwelcoming before. I will survive it again." Her tone left no room for argument. They took the wagon, loaded with items to trade and a list of needed supplies. The ride into town took 3 hours through snow-packed roads, the horses moving carefully, the wagon runners cutting fresh tracks. Maylene sat beside Silas, bundled against the cold, her eyes taking in the landscape with careful attention. She didn't speak much, but Silas was learning that her silences were observation, not discomfort. The town of Ridgemont wasn't large, maybe 300 people spread across a main street of businesses and scattered homesteads radiating outward. It existed primarily to serve the ranches and mining operations in the surrounding territory, a hub of commerce and gossip in equal measure. As they rolled down the main street, Silas felt the stares, saw curtains twitch in windows, watched conversations pause as people turned to look at the Chinese woman sitting proudly beside him. They stopped at the general store and Silas helped Maylene down from the wagon. Her hand in his was small but strong, her grip steady. Inside the store was warm and crowded with the smell of leather, coffee, and pickled goods. Marcus Webb, the owner, looked up from his counter, then did a visible double-take when he saw Maylene. "Silas," Marcus said carefully, "wasn't expecting you for another week at least." "Storm cleared. We needed supplies." Silas handed over the list. "Everything on there, plus whatever else you think makes sense for getting through the rest of winter." Marcus took the paper, his eyes sliding to Maylene and back. "And this is my wife," Silas said, the words still strange in his mouth, but absolutely necessary in this moment. Maylene Carter came in on the stage 2 weeks back. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus's expression went through several rapid transformations. Surprise, confusion, calculation, finally landing on wary politeness. "Ma'am," he said with a nod. "Welcome to Ridgemont." Didn't realize Silas was planning to marry. "It was arranged," Maylene replied, her English carefully formal. "Through the mail-order bride service. I am pleased to be here." "And your family?" Marcus was clearly trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. "They came with you from—" "San Francisco," Maylene supplied smoothly. "My 3 sisters also married into the Carter family. It is an unusual arrangement, but we are making it work." Marcus's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. 4 of you, all at once. Silas and his brothers needed help building their ranch. We needed new opportunities. The match was logical. Maylene moved toward the shelves, examining goods with professional interest. "Your produce selection is limited. Do you receive fresh deliveries in spring?" "When the roads are passable, yeah." Marcus was still processing, his merchant instincts warring with his shock. "Then perhaps we could discuss providing some of our own produce in trade," Maylene continued. "I am establishing a garden. By summer we should have surplus vegetables." Just like that, she'd turned the conversation from gossip to business. Silas watched Marcus respond to the familiar ground, his discomfort easing into negotiation. They spent an hour in the store gathering supplies while Maylene asked sharp questions about pricing, availability, and trade networks. By the time they left, Marcus had agreed to better rates on staples in exchange for future produce and looked slightly dazed by the entire interaction. "You handled that well," Silas said as they loaded the wagon. "I have had practice being the outsider," Maylene replied. "It is better to be useful than to be liked. Liked can change with weather. Useful endures." They were preparing to leave when a woman approached, late 40s, well-dressed, carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to social power. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie, "I don't believe we've been introduced to your companion." "My wife," Silas corrected firmly. "Mrs. Maylene Carter. Maylene, this is Constance Hartford. She runs the church social committee." "How lovely." Constance's smile was sharp as broken glass. "We weren't aware you were planning to marry." especially to someone so exotic. Maylene's expression didn't change, but Silas felt her stillness the way he'd feel a horse about to bolt. "I am Chinese," she said evenly, "if that is what you mean by exotic." "Of course, it's just so unusual for our community. We do try to maintain certain standards." Constance's gaze raked over Maylene with calculated disapproval. "I'm sure you understand how important it is to preserve our way of life here." "Your way of life?" Maylene repeated the words like she was tasting something bitter. "Yes, I understand very well how important it is to some people to keep others out. Now, I didn't say—" "You did not have to say it directly. The meaning was clear." Maylene turned to Silas. "We should return to the ranch. The weather looks like it may turn." Silas helped her into the wagon, his jaw tight with anger he couldn't safely express to a woman of Constance Hartford's social standing. As they pulled away, he caught Constance's expression, satisfaction mixed with disdain. They rode in silence for a mile before Maylene spoke. "This will not be the last time." "No," Silas agreed. "Probably not. Some people in town, they've got narrow ideas about who belongs here." "And you? Do you have narrow ideas?" Silas considered the question carefully. "I've got ideas about loyalty and work and keeping promises. You've been loyal to your sisters, you work harder than anyone should have to, and you kept your promise to come here despite knowing you might face exactly what you faced today." He glanced at her. "Seems to me, those are the ideas that matter." Maylene was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it. "Thank you." "For what?" "For defending me without making me feel helpless. For letting me handle Constance Hartford myself. For understanding that I needed both support and independence." She pulled her coat tighter against wind that had started to pick up. "These are not common gifts from husbands, even good ones." "We're not exactly a common situation," Silas pointed out. "No, we are very much not common." The first drops of sleet began to fall as they reached the ranch, heralding another storm building in the distance. They unloaded the wagon quickly, working together with the efficiency they'd developed over 2 weeks of constant proximity. Inside, the others gathered to help sort supplies. Maylene recounted the trip with clinical precision, omitting the encounter with Constance Hartford, but including useful information about prices and merchants. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Silas found Maylene still in the kitchen, preserving vegetables by lamplight with methodical focus. "You don't have to do this now," he said quietly. "It can wait until morning. I prefer to work when my hands need occupation and my mind needs quiet." She didn't look up from the knife and cutting board. "It helps me think." Silas poured himself coffee and sat at the table, giving her space but offering presence. After a few minutes, Maylene spoke without pausing her work. "There's something I must tell you, something we have not been honest about." Silas felt his stomach tighten. "All right. We did not come here only seeking opportunity. We came here fleeing danger." Her knife moved with precise rhythm, cutting carrots into uniform pieces. "My father died 2 years ago in San Francisco. He had debts, gambling debts, business debts, debts to men who do not forgive or forget. When he died, those debts transferred to his daughters." "That's not legal," Silas said immediately. "Debts don't transfer like property." "They do when powerful men forge documents that say they do. They do when you are Chinese in a city where Chinese have few legal protections. They do when the man collecting believes he owns you, and the law will not contradict him." "What man?" "His name is Victor Blackthorne." Maylene set down the knife, finally meeting Silas's eyes. "He is wealthy, connected, and absolutely without mercy. He believes we belong to him as settlement for our father's debts. We escaped San Francisco before he could collect us. We came here hoping distance and marriage would create protection he could not break." "Does he know where you are?" "Not yet, but he will look. Men like him always look." Her hands were steady, but her eyes showed the fear underneath. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you have taken on. We are not just mail-order brides seeking better lives. We are fugitives. And if Blackthorne finds us, he will try to take us back, legally, if possible. Illegally, if necessary." Silas absorbed this information slowly, fitting it into everything he'd observed over the past 2 weeks. The sisters' constant vigilance, their determination to make themselves indispensable, the way they startled at unexpected sounds. "How much time do you think we have?" he asked finally. "I do not know. Weeks? Months?" He is methodical. He will search carefully, but eventually he will find us. "Then we prepare." Silas stood, moving to stand beside her at the counter. "We make your marriages absolutely legal and documented. We establish you as members of this community. We build protections that even connected men can't easily break." He met her eyes. "And if he comes here trying to take you, he'll find out what Montana ranchers do to predators threatening their families." "We are not truly your family," Maylene said softly. "We are arrangements, contracts. My parents taught me that family is what you build, not just what you're born into." Silas reached out, covering her hand with his. "You came here in good faith. You've worked hard, kept your promises, made this place better. That counts for something. That counts for a lot." Maylene looked down at their joined hands. "I do not know if I can be the wife you deserve. I do not know if I can ever be more than someone running from her past." "Then we start there. We figure out the rest as we go." Silas squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "Get some sleep, Maylene. Tomorrow we'll tell my brothers. Together, we'll figure out how to keep you safe." She nodded, exhaustion finally showing through her careful composure. "Thank you, Silas, for not sending us away. Thank you for trusting me with the truth." After she went upstairs, Silas sat alone in the kitchen, drinking cold coffee and thinking about predators and protection, about promises made and dangers coming. His father had always said that a man's character showed in how he treated people who couldn't defend themselves. That honor meant standing up even when standing up was dangerous. 4 Chinese sisters had come to his ranch seeking shelter. They'd worked hard, brought life to empty spaces, proved themselves valuable partners. If some wealthy businessman from San Francisco thought he could take them back, he was going to learn a hard lesson about Montana ranchers and the lengths they'd go to protect their own. Outside, wind picked up, carrying the scent of another storm. Inside, the ranch house creaked and settled, full now with lives and secrets and futures that hung in uncertain balance. But for tonight, everyone was safe. Everyone was warm. Everyone was together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did on the frontier. But they'd face them as they'd faced everything else. Together, stubborn, determined to build something that lasted despite everything trying to tear it apart. The lamp burned low. Silas finally climbed the stairs to his own room, falling asleep to the sound of wind and the quiet breathing of a house that no longer felt quite so lonely. The morning after Maylene's confession, Silas gathered his brothers in the barn before the women woke. Frost clung to every surface, and their breath made clouds in the pre-dawn darkness as he explained what they'd taken on. Not just 4 mail-order brides, but 4 women running from a man who believed he owned them. Rowan's jaw tightened with each detail. Elias went very still, his expression unreadable. Luke looked like he wanted to hit something. "So we've got some San Francisco businessman who thinks he can just show up and take them?" Rowan said when Silas finished. "That's what you're telling me?" "That's what Maylene believes, yes. She says he's got forged documents, legal connections, enough power to make things difficult even if he's wrong." "He is wrong," Luke said flatly. "They're married to us now, legal and documented. He can't just He can try," Elias interrupted quietly. "Money and connections can do a lot, even out here. We need to be prepared for him to make a real claim. Legal challenges, maybe worse. Then we get ahead of it." Rowan crossed his arms, his face set in lines of stubborn determination. "We make sure the marriages are rock solid. We establish the women as part of this community, get people vouching for them. We build walls he can't break through." "Some people in town already don't want them here," Silas reminded him. "Constance Hartford made that clear yesterday. We can't count on community support if it comes down to Chinese immigrants versus a wealthy white businessman." "Then we count on the people who matter," Rowan shot back. "Sheriff Hayes is a fair man. Judge Morrison doesn't tolerate fraud. We've got friends who'll stand with us." "And if friends aren't enough?" Elias asked. The question hung in the cold air between them. Finally, Silas spoke. "Then we do what Pa would have done. We stand our ground and we don't back down. These women came here in good faith. They've worked hard, kept their promises, made themselves part of this ranch. That means something. That means we protect them. Whatever it takes. Luke nodded immediately. Rowan's agreement came in the form of a grim smile. Even Elias, who preferred peace to conflict, showed resolve in the set of his shoulders. We tell them, Silas decided. All of them. They deserve to know we're with them on this. They gathered everyone in the main room after breakfast, the 8 of them forming a circle that felt both protective and defensive. When Silas explained what he and Maylene had discussed, the other sisters' reactions confirmed they'd all been carrying the same secret weight. Suyin's hands clenched into fists. Gia went pale. Lilene moved closer to Maylene, seeking comfort from the sister who'd always been their anchor. We should have told you sooner, Maylene said, her voice carrying quiet shame. It was not fair to bring danger to your home without warning. You brought yourselves to our home, Silas corrected. The danger followed. That's not the same thing as bringing it deliberately. We knew Blackthorn would search for us, Suyin said, her accent thickening with emotion. We knew he would not simply let us disappear, but we hoped— She broke off, frustration and fear warring in her expression. We hoped distance would be enough. That marriage would be protection. That we could outrun what he claimed we owed. You don't owe him anything, Rowan said firmly. Debts don't transfer to children. That's not how law works, even if he's got paperwork saying otherwise. Law works however powerful men say it works, Gia said softly, speaking more than Silas had heard from her in weeks. Especially for people like us. Especially when the law sees us as less than fully human. The truth of that settled over the room like ash. They all knew she was right. Chinese immigrants faced legal barriers, social prejudice, outright violence in some territories. Even here in Montana, where population was sparse and labor was valued, the women's presence had already drawn hostility. Then we make sure the law sees you as exactly what you are, Luke said with fierce conviction. American wives of American citizens. Property owners, community members, people with rights that can't just be dismissed because some bastard wants to collect on fake debts. Language, Maylene said automatically, but there was warmth in her voice. He's right, though, Elias added. We establish you legally. Get the marriages recorded officially, not just on paper we signed ourselves. Make sure everyone in town knows you're Carter wives now. Build protections that even connected men have to respect. And if he comes anyway? Lilene asked, her voice small. If he comes with legal papers and demands we return? Then he learns what happens when someone threatens a Carter, Rowan said simply. The sisters looked at each other, communicating in that silent way they had. Years of shared experiences compressed into glances and slight gestures. Finally, Maylin nodded. Then we prepare. We build your walls. We become so deeply rooted here that removing us becomes impossible. She met Silas's eyes across the circle. And we pray your confidence is not misplaced. It's not prayer, Silas said. It's preparation, starting today. And they spent the next 3 weeks building those walls brick by deliberate brick. Silas and Rowan rode to town and filed official marriage certificates with the county clerk, making sure every document was properly witnessed and recorded. They met with Judge Morrison, explained the situation in careful terms that emphasized the legal marriages and the possibility of fraudulent debt claims, enlisted his support if challenges arose. Sheriff Hayes listened to their concerns with the careful attention of a man who'd seen enough frontier justice to know when prevention was better than response. He agreed to investigate any claims that came through official channels, promised to send word immediately if anyone started asking questions about 4 Chinese women. Meanwhile, the sisters made themselves indispensable to the ranch in ways that went beyond kitchen work and household management. Maylene transformed not just meals, but the entire food supply system, implementing preservation techniques that stretched stores through late winter and into early spring. She negotiated with Marcus Webb for better prices, established credit based on promised future produce, built relationships with merchants who started to see her as a valuable business contact rather than just a curiosity. Suyin proved she could work cattle as well as any ranch hand, her small frame and fierce determination combining into unexpected effectiveness. She rode fence lines with Rowan, helped drive strays back to the main herd, learned to read weather and landscape with the quick intelligence that made her dangerous to underestimate. More than that, she and Rowan had developed a partnership built on mutual respect and constant low-level competition that seemed to energize them both. She's going to get herself killed trying to prove something, Rowan muttered after Suyin successfully roped a calf that had gotten tangled in brush. "She's going to be fine," Silas replied. "She knows what she's doing." "She thinks she knows what she's doing. There's a difference." But Silas noticed that Rowan stayed close to Suyin during dangerous work, positioning himself to help if needed while giving her space to succeed on her own terms. It was the kind of protective partnership that their father had shared with their mother, not diminishing capability, but supporting it. Gia's contribution was less obvious but equally valuable. She had a gift for healing, both physical injuries and emotional wounds. When Luke strained his shoulder moving heavy equipment, Gia's poultices and gentle massage work eased the pain faster than rest alone would have. When winter melancholy settled over the ranch during long, dark evenings, her paintings brought beauty and hope to walls that had known neither for years. Elias gravitated to her quiet strength like a planet to sun, their conversations growing longer and more personal as weeks passed. Silas would find them together in the evenings, Gia painting while Elias read aloud, their companionship the kind that didn't need constant words to have meaning. And Liling brought joy, simple, uncomplicated, desperately needed joy. She laughed at mistakes, found humor in hardship, approached each day like it held possibilities worth discovering. Luke responded to her energy like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone who matched his fundamental optimism about the world. The ranch transformed from a place where 4 men existed into a home where 8 people built something together. But underneath the daily progress, tension wound tighter with each passing week. Every stranger who passed through town sparked worry. Every unexpected visitor to the ranch sent hearts racing. The sisters had learned to live with fear as a constant companion, but now the brothers felt it too, the weight of knowing that something terrible might be approaching, that preparation might not be enough. 6 weeks after the sisters arrived, a letter came. Silas was in town picking up supplies when Marcus Webb handed him an envelope with unusual formality. "This came on yesterday's stage," he said carefully. "Addressed to you, but the return address is San Francisco. Thought you should know." Silas felt his stomach drop. He took the envelope, noting the expensive paper, the precise handwriting, the weight that suggested multiple pages inside. He didn't open it in the store, didn't want to give Marcus or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing his reaction. Instead, he loaded his supplies with mechanical efficiency, climbed into the wagon, and drove a mile out of town before pulling over. The letter was from Victor Blackthorne. The language was formal, almost courteous, but the threat underneath was crystal clear. Blackthorne knew the sisters were in Montana. He knew they'd married the Carter brothers. He was coming to collect what was legally owed to him, and he expected full cooperation in returning his property, or there would be consequences both legal and personal. He would arrive in 2 weeks. Silas read the letter 3 times, feeling fury build with each pass. The casual certainty of it, the assumption that he could just show up and demand 4 human beings like they were livestock or furniture, made Silas want to put his fist through something. Instead, he carefully folded the letter, tucked it inside his coat, and drove home to tell his family that the storm they'd been anticipating was finally on the horizon. The sisters took the news with varying reactions. Maylene went very still, her composure hardening into something like armor. Suyin swore in Chinese, her hands flexing like she wanted to fight something she couldn't reach. Gia's eyes went distant, retreating to somewhere internal and safe. Liline moved to stand between her sisters and the door, as if she could physically block anyone from taking them. The brothers responded with anger and determination. Rowan wanted to ride to the county line and make it clear Blackthorne wasn't welcome. Luke suggested they contact every rancher they knew, build a wall of witnesses and support. Elias quietly began researching territorial law, looking for legal precedents that might protect immigrant women from fraudulent debt claims. Silas focused on practical preparation. He rode back to town and met with Sheriff Hayes, showed him the letter, explained the full situation without hiding anything. Hayes read Blackthorne's words with a lawman's practiced eye, noting both the legal language and the implied threats. "He's careful," Hayes observed. "Doesn't make any claims that could be easily disproven, but also doesn't provide any real evidence these debts are legitimate. That's telling." "Can you stop him from taking them?" Silas asked bluntly. "If he shows up with proper legal documents from a California court, I can't just ignore them, but I can insist on verification, demand proof of legitimacy, Make sure Judge Morrison reviews everything before any action is taken. Hayes handed the letter back. I can also make it very clear that any attempt to take anyone against their will would be kidnapping, regardless of what papers he's waving around. And if he tries anyway, then we arrest him. But Silas, if this man is as connected as you say, he's not going to do anything obvious. He'll play it legal, use the system, make it look like he's the wrong party seeking justice. They're American citizens now, Silas said. They married American men, established residency here. Doesn't that count for something? It should, but the law around immigrant rights is complicated, and Chinese immigrants especially face challenges. We'll do our best, but you need to prepare for the possibility that his claim might have some legal weight, at least initially. Silas left the sheriff's office feeling like he was trying to build a dam with his bare hands while floodwaters rose. But what else could he do? Give up? Send 4 women back to a man who saw them as property to be collected? That wasn't happening, not while he still drew breath. He found Judge Morrison at the Territorial Courthouse, a solid building that represented law and order on the frontier. Morrison was older, probably 60, with the kind of face that had seen both justice and its absence, learned to navigate the gap between what law said and what law did. "Carter," Morrison greeted him. "I heard you might be coming by. Hayes sent word about your situation. Then you know we've got a problem. You've got a problem. The question is whether it's legal or personal." Morrison gestured for Silas to sit. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." "I can't help if I don't know the full picture." Silas talked for an hour, explaining how the marriages came about, what the sisters had revealed about their past, the letter from Blackthorn, the forged debts and legal threats. Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his expression giving nothing away. When Silas finished, Morrison sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Here's what I can tell you," he finally said. "If Blackthorn has documents from a California court saying these women owe him debts, those documents have legal weight unless proven fraudulent. Proving fraud requires evidence, time, and money. Meanwhile, he could potentially get a court order for their return pending investigation. So he wins." "I didn't say that. I said that's one possible path." Morrison leaned forward. "But there are other considerations. These women are married now. They've established residency in Montana territory. They have husbands who can legally speak for them, make decisions about their welfare. Blackthorn might have debt documents, but he's dealing with a changed situation. Will that be enough? Maybe. Maybe not. But I'll tell you what I told Hayes. I won't rubber stamp anything without thorough review. If Blackthorn shows up with papers, I'll examine them carefully. I'll require proof of legitimacy. I'll make sure the women have legal representation and the opportunity to contest his claims." Morrison's expression hardened. "I won't let anyone be dragged out of my territory without due process, regardless of their country of origin." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. Silas thanked the judge and rode home as the sun set behind mountains that looked peaceful and indifferent to human struggles. At the ranch, he found everyone gathered in the main room, clearly waiting for news. He told them what Hayes and Morrison had said, tried to frame it as positively as possible while not hiding the real challenges they faced. "So we wait," Maylin said when he finished. "We prepare, and we wait for him to arrive, and then we see if walls we have built are strong enough." "We could run," Suyin suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Leave before he arrives. Go somewhere even more remote." "Running didn't work the first time," Gia said softly. "He found us across an ocean and half a continent. He will find us again. Running just delays what must be faced." "Then we face it," Rowan said firmly, "together, as a family." The word hung in the air, family. They'd been using it casually for weeks, but this felt like something more formal. An acknowledgement that whatever legal arrangements had brought them together, something deeper had formed in the crucible of work and weather and shared purpose. Maylene looked at Silas, and he saw in her eyes the question she couldn't quite ask. "Are we really family to you, or just obligations you're too honorable to abandon?" "My father used to say that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family," Silas said, speaking to all of them, but holding Maylene's gaze. "You've all been loyal to this ranch, to each other, to the agreements we made. That makes you family. That means we stand together, whatever comes." Luke moved to stand beside Liling, his hand finding hers. Elias stepped closer to Gia, not quite touching but clearly present. Rowan and Suyin exchanged a look that held volumes of unspoken understanding. And Malin crossed the space between herself and Silas, stopping close enough that he could see gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough that her voice was for him alone, even though everyone could hear. "If we survive this," she said quietly, "if we come through what is coming intact, I would like to try being a real wife. Not just an arrangement or legal protection, but a true partnership." "I'd like that too," Silas replied, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. "But we don't have to wait. We can start trying now." Her smile was small but genuine, and when she stepped back, something had shifted between them. Potential becoming intention, contract becoming choice. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange combination of ordinary ranch work and escalating preparation. They continued daily tasks, feeding cattle, mending equipment, managing stores. But everything carried an undercurrent of tension, like waiting for lightning to strike. Silas arranged for several rancher friends to visit during the week Blackthorn was expected, creating witnesses and support without making it obvious they were gathering forces. Rowan made sure all the rifles were cleaned and loaded, placed strategically around the house and barn. Elias worked with Gia to document everything, the marriages, the work the sisters had done, testimonials from people in town who'd interacted with them positively. And the sisters prepared in their own ways. Maylene cooked like she was storing up sustenance against siege. Suyin rode the fence lines obsessively, memorizing every inch of Carterland. Gia painted portraits of her sisters, capturing them in moments of strength and joy, creating records of who they were beyond anyone's claims of ownership. Lillian wrote letters to friends in San Francisco, establishing paper trails of their journey and current status. On the 14th day after the letter arrived, a sleek black carriage rolled down the road toward the ranch. Silas spotted it from the barn and felt everything inside him go cold and hard. He rang the bell that meant everyone should come immediately, and within minutes the 8 of them stood together in front of the house, presenting a united front. The carriage stopped 50 feet away. A driver climbed down, large, professional, the kind of man hired as much for intimidation as transportation. He opened the carriage door with practiced deference. Victor Blackthorn stepped out like he owned the ground beneath his feet. He was maybe 50, dressed in expensive clothes, too fine for frontier travel, carrying himself with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never faced a door he couldn't buy his way through. His eyes swept over the assembled group with cold assessment, lingering on the 4 sisters with something that made Silas's hands ball into fists. "Mr. Carter, I presume," Blackthorn said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm Victor Blackthorn from San Francisco. I believe you received my letter." "I did," Silas replied, keeping his voice level. "And I'm telling you the same thing I would have written back. You've got no claim here. These women are married American citizens now. Your business is finished." "I'm afraid it's not that simple." Blackthorn produced a leather folder from inside his coat, moving with unhurried confidence. "I have documents, properly notarized, legally binding, showing debts owed by the late Mr. Chen to various business interests I represent. Upon his death, those debts transferred to his daughters. It's all very properly arranged." "Debts don't transfer to children," Rowan interjected. "That's not legal. It is when the debts are secured against future earning potential of family members, as was common practice in certain immigrant communities." Blackthorn's smile was thin and cold. "I assure you, everything here is legally sound. I've had multiple attorneys review the documentation." "Then you've had multiple attorneys lie to you," Elias said quietly, "because that kind of debt bondage was outlawed federally. Any contract claiming to enforce it is void." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his smooth facade. "And you are?" "Someone who knows law well enough to recognize fraud when I see it." "I see. Well, perhaps we should let proper authorities make that determination." Blackthorn gestured toward his carriage, where a second man was emerging, older with the look of a lawyer who'd made careers from navigating legal gray areas. "This is Mr. Ashford, my legal counsel. He has additional documentation showing that these marriages are themselves fraudulent, entered into specifically to avoid legitimate debt obligations. Under California law, such marriages can be annulled, making the women subject to return for debt settlement." Maylene made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Silas moved closer to her, not quite touching, but clearly protective. You can show your papers to Judge Morrison in town, Silas said. He'll review them properly. But these women aren't going anywhere until a court says otherwise. I'm afraid I have a court order right here. Ashford produced a document with flourishes that looked official, issued by a judge in San Francisco, requiring the return of these women pending resolution of debt claims. It's enforceable in all territories, including Montana. Let me see that, Elias said, reaching for the document. Before anyone could move, a new voice cut through the tension. I wouldn't touch anything they're offering without a witness present. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Hayes riding up the road, accompanied by another man, older, well-dressed, carrying a worn leather satchel that marked him as someone who dealt in documents professionally. Sheriff, Blackthorne said smoothly, his expression not changing. How convenient. You can help facilitate the return of these women to California, where they can properly answer for their obligations. I can help make sure everything's done legally and properly, Hayes corrected, which means that court order gets reviewed by our judge before anyone goes anywhere. This here is Mr. Peterson, a federal investigator. He's been looking into some interesting paperwork coming out of San Francisco, specifically documents claiming to enforce debt bondage on immigrant populations. The change in Blackthorne's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Calculation replacing confidence, wariness entering eyes that had been coldly certain. I don't know what you're implying, Blackthorne said carefully. I'm implying that several complaints have been filed about forged documents, fraudulent debt claims, and illegal attempts to claim ownership of human beings, Peterson said, opening his satchel and producing his own paperwork. Your name has appeared in multiple investigations, Mr. Blackthorne, which makes me very interested in examining those documents you're carrying. This is harassment, Ashford interjected quickly. My client has done nothing illegal. These are legitimate business matters. Then you won't mind showing me the original debt documents, properly signed and notarized, along with proof that Mr. Chen actually agreed to terms that put his daughters up as collateral. Peterson's voice was mild, but his eyes were sharp. You do have those originals, don't you? Not just copies that could have been created anywhere. The silence stretched. Blackthorne and Ashford exchanged a glance that communicated volumes. Finally, Blackthorne's expression hardened into something uglier than his smooth facade had shown. This is a waste of time, he said flatly. Sheriff, I insist you enforce this court order immediately. I insist you show me documentation that proves it's legitimate, Hayes replied. Right now, all I see is papers that might or might not be worth anything. Until Judge Morrison reviews them, nobody's getting enforced anywhere. You're protecting criminals, Blackthorne snapped, his cultured mask finally cracking. These women fled legal obligations. They're fugitives from legitimate debt collection. I have every right. You have the right to present your case in court, Peterson interrupted. What you don't have is the right to take anyone by force based on questionable documents. So I suggest you and Mr. Ashford accompany us into town, where we can examine everything properly. And if I refuse? Then I arrest you for attempted kidnapping and document fraud. Peterson's tone remained pleasant, but steel showed underneath. Your choice, Mr. Blackthorne. Legal process or jail cell. Both end up in the same place eventually. You explaining to a judge why your papers smell like forgery. For a long moment, Blackthorne stared at the sisters with naked fury. Silas saw the calculation there, weighing options, considering whether force might still work, deciding if his connections could override local authority. Then something shifted in his expression. He straightened his coat, smoothed his features back into cold composure. Very well, we'll proceed through proper channels. But I assure you, Sheriff, these women will answer for their obligations. Today, next week, next month. Eventually, debts get collected. Always. He climbed back into his carriage with stiff dignity. Ashford followed, clutching his folder of questionable documents. The driver snapped the reins and the carriage rolled away toward town, trailed by Hayes and Peterson on horseback. The silence left behind felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Then Lileen's legs gave out. Luke caught her before she hit the ground, supporting her weight as she shook with reaction. Gia made a small broken sound and turned into Elias's chest, finally allowing herself to fall apart. Suyin stood rigid, tears streaming down her face while her body refused to acknowledge weakness. And Mayleen, strong, controlled Mayleen, turned to Silas with eyes that held both hope and terror. Is it over? She whispered. I don't know, Silas said honestly. But we survived today. That's something. She nodded, then collapsed against him like a puppet with cut strings. He held her while she trembled, feeling how much strength it had taken for her to stand there, facing the man who'd haunted them across a continent. How close she'd come to breaking, but hadn't. Around them, his brothers held their wives. No longer just contractual arrangements, but people they'd chosen to protect, to stand with, to fight for. Whatever came next, court battles, legal challenges, the slow grinding process of proving fraud, they'd face it together. The carriage disappeared down the road, carrying a predator who'd learned that Montana ranchers didn't surrender their own without a fight. They stood together in front of the house for a long time after the carriage disappeared, nobody quite ready to move or speak or acknowledge how close they'd come to losing everything. The Montana wind blew cold across the ranch, carrying the scent of snow and sage, indifferent to human drama playing out beneath its endless sky. Finally, Silas felt Maylene straighten against him, her spine finding its steel again as she pulled back enough to meet his eyes. I need to sit down, she said quietly, before I fall down. They moved inside as a group, nobody willing to separate even to perform simple tasks. The main room felt too small for 8 people and all their collective fear and relief, but they pressed together anyway, seeking comfort in proximity. Luke guided Lileen to a chair, kneeling beside her while she fought to control shaking hands. Gia remained tucked against Elias's side, his arm around her shoulders like he could physically shield her from everything they'd just faced. Rowan and Suyin sat close together on the settee, not quite touching but clearly drawing strength from nearness. And Maylene sank into the chair closest to the fire, her usual composure fractured into something more human and vulnerable. Silas crouched beside her, one hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. We should eat something, Maylene said, the automatic caretaker instinct rising even through her own distress. We should sit, Silas interrupted gently. For once, just sit. Let someone else worry about what needs doing. She looked at him with eyes that held gratitude and exhaustion in equal measure, then nodded. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds, the crackling fire and the wind outside and their own breathing slowly returning to normal rhythms. Then Suyin spoke, her voice raw. He will come back. You know this, yes? Men like him do not give up because one attempt fails. He will find another way. Let him try, Rowan said flatly. Next time we'll be even more prepared. You do not understand. Suyin turned to face him, her expression fierce and desperate. He has money, connections, lawyers who make lies look like truth. We have, what? Hope? Good intentions? These things do not win against power. We have law on our side, Elias said quietly. Real law, not forged documents. Peterson wouldn't have shown up here if there wasn't already an investigation. Blackthorn's scheme is unraveling. Investigation takes time, Gia whispered. Time he can use to hurt us in other ways, reputation, livelihood, safety. He does not need to win in court to destroy what we have built here. The fear in her voice cut through the room like a knife. Luke stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back, energy needing outlet. So what do? He demanded. Just wait? Hope Peterson's investigation moves faster than Blackthorn's next move? That doesn't feel like enough. It is not enough, Maylene agreed. But it is what we have. She looked at each of her sisters, then at the brothers who'd stood between them and the predator at their door. We knew this would not be simple. We knew running only delayed what must be faced. Today we faced it. We survived. That is victory, even if it does not feel like one. It feels like borrowed time, Lileen said softly, like standing in a storm that has paused but not ended. Silas squeezed Maylene's hand gently, drawing her attention. Then we use the time we've borrowed. We keep building those walls. We make ourselves so much a part of this community, this territory, that removing you becomes not just difficult, but unthinkable. How? Maylene asked. How do we become unthinkable to remove when half the town already wishes we had never come? By proving them wrong. By being so valuable, so integrated, so clearly belonging here that even people who don't like you have to admit you've earned your place. Silas stood, pulling Maylene up with him. We start by going to town tomorrow. All of us. We attend church services. We speak with people. We show Blackthorn and anyone else watching that we're not hiding or running or acting like we've got something to be ashamed of. Church, Suyin said flatly, where Constance Hartford and her friends will smile with teeth and whisper poison the moment we turn our backs. Maybe, Rowan acknowledged, but also where decent people will see you as community members, not curiosities. Where you become real to folks who've only heard rumors. And if we are not welcome, Gia asked, then we make ourselves welcome anyway, Elias said. Politely, persistently, until welcome becomes easier than continued resistance. The sisters looked at each other in that silent communication they'd perfected over years of facing the world as a unit. Silas watched emotions flicker across their faces. Doubt, fear, determination, resignation, hope. Finally, Maylene nodded. Very well. We will go to town. We will be community members. We will make ourselves unthinkable to remove. She met Silas's eyes. And we will pray this is enough. They spent the rest of the evening in quiet preparation, mending clothes to look their best, rehearsing English phrases for social situations, steeling themselves for judgment and scrutiny. When they finally went to bed, the brothers returned to their makeshift arrangements downstairs, while the sisters climbed to their separate rooms. But an hour later, Silas heard his door open softly. Maylene stood silhouetted in lamplight from the hall, wearing a simple nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. I cannot sleep, she said quietly. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. His face. His certainty that he owned us. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. May I stay here? Just to be less alone? Of course. Silas moved over in the bed, making space. You never have to ask permission to not be alone. She slipped under the covers, maintaining careful distance between them, but her presence filled the space with warmth and the faint scent of the soap she made from herbs and lye. They lay in darkness, listening to the house settle and the wind test the shutters. I was 11 when my father brought us to America, Maylene said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. He promised us opportunity, education, a future better than what China could offer. For years it was true. We had a good life in San Francisco. He worked hard, built connections, gave us everything we needed. What happened? Silas asked gently. He started gambling. Small amounts at first, then larger. He thought he could win back losses, prove himself clever enough to beat the odds. Instead, he fell deeper into debt. When he died, we discovered he had borrowed from everyone. Legitimate banks, community lending circles, men like Blackthorn who loan money to desperate people at rates that guarantee they can never repay. And Blackthorn claimed you as settlement. Not immediately. First he was sympathetic. Offered to forgive some debts if we worked for him, managing properties, keeping accounts, tasks that seemed reasonable. But the debts never decreased. The work became more controlling. And then he produced documents we had never seen, claiming our father had signed papers putting us up as collateral for loans we knew nothing about. Silas felt anger kindle in his chest. Those documents were forged. Of course they were. But proving forgery requires lawyers, money, time, all things we did not have. So we ran, used what little resources remained to buy train tickets east, then passage on a stage west, putting as much distance between ourselves and San Francisco as possible. She turned toward him in the darkness. We never meant to deceive you. We truly came seeking marriages, new lives. We just did not mention we were also fleeing a monster. I'm glad you came, Silas said simply. Deception or not, I'm glad you chose this ranch, this territory. I'm glad you're here. Even though we brought danger with us? You brought yourselves. That's what matters. He reached out carefully, finding her hand in the darkness. And tomorrow we start showing everyone else why you matter too. She squeezed his fingers, holding on like he was an anchor in uncertain waters. Eventually, her breathing deepened into sleep, but she never released his hand. Silas lay awake for a long time, feeling the warmth of her beside him, thinking about monsters and protection and the strange paths that brought strangers together into something that might become family. Morning came cold and bright, the kind of clarity that made everything feel possible despite evidence to the contrary. They ate breakfast in determined silence, everyone focused on the task ahead, presenting themselves to a community that might reject them entirely. The sisters dressed in their finest clothes, dresses that combine traditional Chinese elements with American practicality, hair styled with careful attention, deportment that suggested confidence they might not entirely feel. The brothers wore clean shirts and their best coats, armed with respectability instead of rifles. The ride to town took 2 hours. 8 people crowded into a wagon built for supplies rather than passengers. Nobody spoke much, but hands found hands, shoulders pressed against shoulders, small gestures of solidarity replacing words. Ridgemont's church sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower that reached toward sky like aspiration made physical. People were already gathering when the Carters arrived. Ranchers and shopkeepers, miners and their families, the full spectrum of frontier society dressed in Sunday respectability. Conversations died as the wagon pulled up. Silas felt every eye turned toward them, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down like physical force. Beside him, Maylene sat absolutely straight, her face composed into serene dignity that revealed nothing of what she must be feeling. "Ready?" Silas asked quietly. "No," Maylene replied, "but we do it anyway." They climbed down from the wagon together, the 8 of them forming a united front as they walked toward the church entrance. People stepped aside, creating space that felt less like courtesy and more like quarantine. Silas heard whispers starting, some curious, some disapproving, some genuinely hostile. Then Sheriff Hayes appeared at the church door, his presence deliberate and pointed. "Morning, Carter family," he said loudly enough to carry. "Good to see you all. Come on in. Plenty of room." It was an endorsement, clear and public. People noticed. The whispers changed tone, confusion mixing with speculation. Hayes was respected here. His opinion carried weight. If he was treating the Chinese women as legitimate community members, others would have to reconsider their automatic dismissal. Inside, the church was simple. Wooden pews, whitewashed walls, windows that let in light without expensive stained glass. It smelled like pine and candle wax, and the particular scent of many people gathered in close quarters. Marcus Webb and his wife sat near the front. When Marcus saw them enter, he did something unexpected. He stood and gestured to the pew beside theirs. "Mrs. Carter," he said formally to Maylene, "your business proposal about summer vegetables. I'd like to discuss it after services, if you've got time." It was a lifeline, an acknowledgement of value beyond simple tolerance. Maylene grasped it immediately. "Of course, Mr. Webb, I would welcome the conversation." They settled into pews, the sisters sitting with their husbands in an arrangement that looked natural and proper. Silas sat beside Maylene, acutely aware of people watching, judging, forming opinions that would spread through town faster than wildfire. The service itself passed in a blur of hymns and readings, and a sermon about welcoming strangers that felt pointed enough to be deliberate. Silas suspected Sheriff Hayes might have had a conversation with the minister about topic selection. When it ended, people filed out with the usual social rituals, greeting neighbors, making plans, exchanging news. The Carter group stayed together, not forcing themselves on anyone, but also not hiding. Marcus Webb approached with his wife, Sarah, a practical woman who ran the town's small lending library. "Mrs. Carter," Sarah said formally to Maylin, then to the other sisters. "Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Carter, welcome to Ridgemont. I understand you've recently arrived from San Francisco?" "Yes, ma'am," Maylene replied. "Through an arrangement with your mail-order bride service, we are settling into ranch life. I imagine that's quite an adjustment. San Francisco to Montana wilderness must be challenging." "We are learning. The land is beautiful. The people—" Maylene paused delicately. "We hope to know them better." Sarah's expression suggested she understood exactly what Maylene wasn't saying. "Well, if you're interested, Danji? We have a women's reading circle that meets Thursday afternoons. All are welcome." It was an opening, careful and conditional, but real. Maylene seized it immediately. "We would be honored to attend." Other conversations followed, some strained, some genuinely friendly, all observed by the wider community. Judge Morrison appeared briefly to assure them that Blackthorn's documents were still under review, that nothing would be decided hastily. A rancher named Tom Sullivan, who'd bought cattle from the Carters, stopped to welcome the wives, his acceptance clearly rooted in respect for Silas rather than the women themselves, but acceptance nonetheless. And then Constance Hartford arrived, flanked by 2 other women who shared her expression of refined disapproval. How unexpected to see you all here, Constance said, her voice carrying that particular tone that sounded polite while communicating contempt. I wouldn't have thought our services would align with your traditional practices. We are Christian, Laileen said quietly, surprising everyone. Our father converted in China, raised us in faith. We have attended church our entire lives. Constance's expression flickered. She'd clearly expected exotic religious practices she could condemn, not familiar common ground. I see. Well, that's fortunate. Though I must say the circumstances of your arrival remain quite irregular. No more irregular than any mail-order bride arrangement, Silas interjected firmly, which this community has accepted before without issue. Those brides were... Constance stopped herself, but the implication hung clear. Were what? Rowan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. White? American-born? What exactly made them more acceptable than 4 women who've worked harder in 6 weeks than most people work in 6 months? I simply mean that cultural differences create challenges. For everyone involved. Constance's smile was thin and sharp. I'm sure you're all doing your best, but integration takes time, and some gaps may be too wide to bridge. Then I suppose we will discover which gaps are real and which are simply excuses for small-mindedness, Maylene said calmly. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hartford. It is noted. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Constance's expression tightened, but she had no good response. She swept away with her companions, leaving behind a wake of whispered disapproval. That could have gone better, Elias observed quietly. That went exactly as expected, Maylene corrected. She declared herself an enemy in public. Now we know where we stand. But others, Gia gestured to the people still milling about, many of whom had watched the exchange. Some might follow her lead. Some will, Sheriff Hayes said, appearing beside them. Some won't. That's always how it goes. What matters is you showed up, stood your ground, proved you're here to stay. He lowered his voice. I got word this morning. Blackthorn left town on yesterday's stage, headed back to San Francisco. He gave up? Suyin sounded skeptical. Not likely. More probably regrouping, preparing a different approach. But Peterson's investigation is moving forward. Several other families have come forward with similar claims about forged documents and fraudulent debts. It's turning into a bigger case than Blackthorn expected. How long? Silas asked. How long until we know for certain? Weeks at minimum, maybe months. These things move slow. Hayes glanced around, checking who might overhear. But between you and me, Peterson thinks the whole scheme is going to collapse. Too many inconsistencies, too much evidence of forgery. Blackthorn might be connected, but he's not invincible. It was the most hope they'd had in weeks. Silas saw it ripple through the group, spines straightening, expressions lightening, fear receding enough to let other feelings through. They stayed in town for another hour, making their presence felt, building connections one careful conversation at a time. Not everyone was friendly, but enough people were decent that it felt like progress. By the time they loaded back into the wagon, exhaustion had replaced anxiety, but it was the good kind, the fatigue that came from hard work rather than helpless worry. The ride home was quieter than the journey in, everyone processing what they'd accomplished and what still lay ahead. Halfway back to the ranch, snow began to fall, soft flakes that caught in hair and on shoulders, gentle reminders that winter wasn't finished with them yet. Luke started singing, his voice carrying over the sound of wheels and horses. It was a song their mother had taught them, something about rivers and journeys and finding home. Lillian joined in on the second verse, her accent giving the familiar words exotic music. Then the others added their voices, Suyin's fierce alto, Gia's gentle harmony, Rowan's rough bass, until all 8 of them were singing together under falling snow. It wasn't perfect. Some voices were stronger than others, some knew different versions of the words, but it blended into something that felt like belonging. When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. They unloaded the wagon with practiced efficiency, everyone knowing their roles, moving together like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Inside, Maylene moved to the kitchen automatically, but Silas caught her hand. Not tonight, he said gently. Tonight someone else cooks. You've done enough for one day. She looked like she wanted to argue, but Lilene was already pulling out ingredients, chattering about a recipe their mother used to make. Gia moved to help, and soon the kitchen held laughter and the good smells of cooking food. The brothers built up fires against the cold while the sisters worked. Then they all gathered around the table, not formal or arranged, just finding seats naturally, passing dishes, filling plates, existing together in the warm light of lamplight and firelight. "We did well today," Rowan said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "We survived," Suyin corrected. "That is not the same as doing well." "It's a start, though," Luke offered. "First time in town as a whole family, first time standing together in public. That matters." "It matters if it leads somewhere," Gia said softly. "If today begins a path toward real acceptance rather than just forced tolerance." "Acceptance takes time," Elias said, "but forced tolerance is still better than open hostility. We work with what we have." "What we have is each other," Maylene said quietly. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. "We have this house, this land, this family we are building from contracts and choices. That is more than we had 6 weeks ago. That is more than we dared hope for when we fled San Francisco. It is more than I hoped for when I sent those letters," Silas added. "I expected arrangements and partnerships. What we're building feels like something more." "Feels like home," Luke said simply. The word hung in the air, fragile and hopeful. Home. Not just shelter or safety or legal protection, but the deeper thing. The place where you belonged, where you were wanted, where you could be yourself without armor or pretense. "Yes," Lilene said softly. "It feels like home." They finished the meal in companionable quiet, then lingered at the table longer than necessary, none of them quite ready to break the spell of togetherness. Eventually, exhaustion won over contentment, and they began the nightly routines, cleaning dishes, banking fires, preparing for bed. This time, when Silas climbed the stairs to his room, he found Maylene already there, sitting by the window and looking out at snow falling through darkness. "I did not ask permission," she said without turning. "I am sorry if I presume too much." "You're not presuming." Silas crossed to stand beside her. "This is your room too. Your home. You don't need permission to be in it." "Our room," she corrected softly. "Our home." Those words still feel strange to say. "They'll get easier with practice." She turned to look at him, and in the lamplight her face showed both vulnerability and determination. "I meant what I said before, about trying to be a real wife, a real partnership, not just legal protection or convenient arrangement." "I know, I meant what I said too. Then help me understand, what does that look like? How do we build real when we started with contracts?" Silas thought about his parents, the partnership they'd modeled, the love that had grown from respect and shared purpose. "I think it starts with choosing each other every day. Not because papers say we're married, but because we want to be, because we make each other's lives better just by being in them." "I want that," Maylene said. "I want to choose you and to be chosen. I want this to be real." "Then let's make it real." Silas reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Starting now, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until choosing each other becomes as natural as breathing." She smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine and absolutely beautiful. "One choice at a time," she agreed. They stood together at the window watching snow fall on their land, their ranch, their home. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched vast and indifferent, full of dangers both known and yet to come. But inside, in this room, in this moment, 8 people who'd been strangers were becoming family. And whatever storms came next, whether from San Francisco predators or small-town prejudice, or the simple challenges of building lives on the frontier, they would face them together. The nightmare they'd been running from was finally ending. In its place, something new was beginning, something that might actually be worth the risks they'd taken to find it. Spring came to Montana like a promise kept after a hard winter. Snow melted into streams that ran silver through thawing ground. Grass pushed up through last year's dead stalks, and the air carried warmth that felt like forgiveness for all the cold months that had come before. 3 months had passed since Blackthorn's visit. 3 months of waiting for news from Peterson's investigation while building lives that felt increasingly real and permanent. The sisters had settled into the ranch with the completeness of roots finding soil, transforming spaces and routines until the house no longer remembered what it had been like with just 4 lonely men rattling around inside it. Maylene had taken over not just the kitchen, but the entire household management, her organizational genius turning chaos into system. The root cellar now held preserved foods arranged by type and season. The pantry functioned like a well-run business, and meals had evolved from fuel into actual pleasure. She'd also started the garden she'd promised Marcus Webb, turning a patch of neglected ground into organized rows where seeds waited for warmer weather to fulfill their potential. Suyin worked the ranch alongside Rowan with a partnership that had evolved from competition into something that looked remarkably like respect mixed with attraction neither would quite acknowledge directly. She could rope and ride as well as any hand they'd ever hired, her small frame and fierce determination combining into unexpected effectiveness. More than once, Silas had caught them working together with a synchronization that suggested conversations happening in glances and gestures rather than words. Gia had transformed the main room into a space that held beauty alongside function, her paintings bringing color and life to walls that had known neither. She'd also discovered a gift for healing that went beyond poultices and herbs. Something in her gentle presence eased pain, both physical and emotional. Elias gravitated to her like a plant to sunlight, their quiet companionship deepening into something that needed few words to communicate volumes. And Lileen brought laughter. She'd made friends with several young women in town during the Thursday reading circle meetings, her cheerful energy breaking through reserve and prejudice with the unstoppable force of genuine kindness. Luke responded to her joy like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone who saw possibilities instead of limitations, who believed the future could be better than the past. The marriages had evolved from contracts into something none of them could quite name, but all of them felt. Partnerships that were becoming real through daily choice and shared purpose. Silas and Maylene had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural, sleeping in the same bed most nights, talking through ranch decisions together, building trust through accumulated small moments of vulnerability and support. But underneath the progress and growing comfort, they all waited for the other shoe to drop. Blackthorn had retreated, but not surrendered. Peterson's investigation continued, but hadn't yet reached conclusions. Every letter that arrived, every stranger who passed through town, every unexpected visit sent tension spiking through the household. Until the morning, Sheriff Hayes rode up to the ranch with news that would change everything. It was mid-April, the kind of day that made you believe winter might actually be finished. Silas was working on fence repairs with Rowan and Suyin when he spotted Hayes approaching. Something in the sheriff's posture, a looseness that hadn't been there in months, made Silas's heart rate pick up. "Whatever that expression means, I hope it's good news," Rowan muttered as they set down their tools and walked to meet the sheriff. Hayes dismounted with a grin that split his weathered face. "Peterson sent word. The investigation's concluded. Thought you'd want to hear in person, rather than through official channels." "And?" Silas couldn't quite breathe properly, waiting for the answer that would determine everything. Blackthorn's scheme collapsed completely. Peterson found 14 other families with the same forged documents, same fraudulent debt claims. When they compared all the paperwork, the forgeries were obvious. Wrong dates, impossible signatures, inconsistencies that no legitimate legal process would have produced. Hayes pulled a letter from his coat. A federal judge in San Francisco issued warrants for Blackthorn and Ashford both. Fraud, attempted kidnapping, racketeering, about 6 other charges. They're in custody, awaiting trial. Suyin made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Rowan caught her as her knees buckled, supporting her weight while she shook with reaction. "The debts?" Silas managed to ask through the roaring in his ears. "Void. All of them. The judge ruled that even if some original debts existed, the way Blackthorn tried to collect them violated federal law. The women are free and clear, legally and officially." Hayes handed over the letter. "Peterson wanted you to have the documentation. Said to tell you all that you can stop looking over your shoulders now. It's done." Silas took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady, staring at words that meant freedom, meant safety, meant the nightmare was finally, truly over. Behind him he heard Suyin crying openly now, heard Rowan's low voice offering comfort, heard the barn door open as Elias emerged and then stopped, reading the situation in their faces. "What happened?" Elias called out. "It's over," Silas called back, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Blackthorn's arrested. The debts are void. It's over. Elias stood absolutely still for a moment, processing. Then he turned and ran toward the house, shouting for Gia and Maylene and Lileen, his usual quiet composure shattered by relief too big to contain. By the time Silas reached the house, all 8 of them were gathering in the front yard, the sisters spilling out of doorways, faces showing shock and hope and disbelief. Hayes repeated the news for everyone, his grin never fading, clearly enjoying being the bearer of impossibly good tidings. When he finished, silence held for maybe 3 seconds. Then Lillian started laughing, great whooping peals of joy that sounded like birds taking flight. Luke picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing together. Gia collapsed against Elias, crying tears that were finally happy instead of terrified. Rowan and Suyin stood together, foreheads touching, sharing relief in the space between breaths. And Maylene turned to Silas with eyes that held the weight of 3 years of running, of fear, of forcing herself to be strong when she wanted to break. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them, burying her face against his chest while her shoulders shook with sobs she'd been holding back for what must have felt like forever. "It's really over?" she asked against his shirt, her voice muffled and small and desperately hopeful. "It's really over," Silas confirmed, holding her tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his own. "You're free. You're safe. You're home." She pulled back enough to look at him, tears streaming down her face but smiling through them with radiant relief. "Home," she repeated, testing the word. "Yes, home." Hayes stayed for lunch, regaling them with details of the investigation, how Peterson had tracked down families across 3 states, how the evidence had mounted until even Blackthorn's expensive lawyers couldn't spin their way clear, how the judge had been personally offended by the attempt to use the legal system to perpetuate what amounted to slavery. "There's talk of new federal legislation," Hayes said around a mouthful of Maylene's exceptional bread. "Protection for immigrant populations, stricter enforcement against debt bondage schemes. Peterson thinks your case might actually change some laws." "We just wanted to be free," Maylene said quietly. "If our suffering helps others find freedom, perhaps it was worth something." "It was worth everything," Silas said firmly. "And you didn't just survive it, you helped bring down a predator who would have kept destroying lives. That matters." After Hayes left, the ranch felt different somehow. Lighter, like a weight had been lifted that they hadn't fully realized they'd been carrying. The sisters moved through evening chores with energy that bordered on giddy, chattering in Chinese and English mixed together, their voices carrying joy that had been absent or suppressed for too long. That night, Silas found Malin on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cool evening air, staring up at stars that blazed across Montana's endless sky. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. "Don't want to sleep. Don't want to miss being free." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. For 3 years, every moment was shaped by fear. Every decision filtered through the question of whether it would keep us safe from him. Now that fear is gone, and I do not quite know how to exist without it. "You learn," Silas said gently. "Same way you learned everything else. One day at a time, one choice at a time." "What do I choose now?" She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her face showed both vulnerability and curiosity. "When safety is no longer the only consideration, what do I choose?" "What do you want to choose?" Maylene was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "I want to choose this, you, this ranch, this life, this family we have built. Not because I need protection or because contracts say I should, but because I genuinely want it." "Then choose it," Silas said simply. "Choose me. Choose us. Choose this life because it makes you happy, not just safe." "Does it make you happy? Truly?" Her eyes searched his face. "You did not ask for 4 Chinese sisters. You asked for quiet American brides who would fit seamlessly into your existing life. Instead, you got complicated women with dangerous pasts and cultural differences that make everything harder. Is this what you wanted?" Silas thought about the ranch 6 months ago. Functional, but empty. Maintained, but not loved. Existing rather than living. He thought about what it had become, full of voices and laughter and color, challenges and complications and growth. Life in all its messy, difficult, beautiful complexity. "I didn't know what I wanted," he admitted. "I thought I wanted simple and easy. Someone to fill a role without disrupting the status quo." He cupped her face gently with one hand. "What I got was you. Fierce, brilliant, brave you. Complicated and challenging and absolutely worth every difficulty. So yes, this is what I want. You are what I want. She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. Not the careful, composed expression she wore for the world, but something real and unguarded and radiantly happy. Then I choose you too, she said. Every day, for all the days we have. I choose us. They sat together on the porch until the stars wheeled overhead and the moon set behind distant mountains, making plans for a future that no longer felt borrowed or conditional. Gardens to plant, buildings to expand, maybe children someday to fill the house with even more life and noise and love. Inside, similar conversations were happening in other rooms. Rowan and Suyin had finally stopped dancing around what everyone else could see, had acknowledged that their constant competition was really attraction disguised as conflict, had decided to try being partners in every sense rather than just ranch work. "You're still the most stubborn woman I've ever met," Rowan told her, his complaint undermined by the way he held her close. "And you are still the most impossible man," Suyin replied, but she was smiling. "We are well matched in our impossibility." Elias and Gia, true to their quieter natures, had slipped into being a couple so gradually that the actual transition was hard to pinpoint. They sat together in the main room, Gia painting by lamplight while Elias read aloud from poetry. Their contentment so complete it needed no declaration or drama. And Luke and Lileen were already planning a proper wedding, not just the quick legal ceremony they'd had for protection, but a real celebration with the whole community invited. Lileen wanted flowers and music, and everyone to understand that their marriage was about love rather than necessity. Luke wanted whatever made her happy, his devotion to her joy as complete as sunrise following night. The next morning, Silas called everyone together after breakfast. They gathered in the main room, the 8 of them forming a circle that had become familiar, comfortable. The original plan was always temporary, Silas started. Quick marriages for legal protection, partnerships for ranch survival. Now circumstances have changed. You're not running anymore. You're not bound by desperation. And you've got actual choices. He saw understanding dawn on the sisters' faces. He was giving them an out, offering freedom beyond just legal status. "So here's what I'm proposing," Silas continued. "We do this right. Real weddings, if that's what you want. Real commitments, made without fear or pressure or contracts forcing your hands. You've earned the right to choose your futures. If those futures are here with us, we'll be honored. If they're somewhere else, we'll understand and support you finding them." Maylene stood, speaking for all of them the way she so often did. "We have already chosen. Did you not hear us? We choose this life, this ranch, these marriages, not because we must, but because we want to." "I know, but I needed you to know that you could choose something else," Silas said. "That the option exists, that you're free in every sense, including being free to leave if that's what would make you happy." "We are free," Suyin agreed. "Free to stay. Free to build real lives here. Free to love men who stood between us and monsters, who chose to protect strangers, who made themselves family through loyalty rather than blood. Free to transform contracts into vows we actually mean," Gia added softly. "Free to celebrate rather than just survive," Lileen finished, her enthusiasm impossible to contain. Rowan cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Then I guess we should do this proper. Real proposals, real weddings, real everything." He turned to Suyin, dropped to one knee with cowboy awkwardness that somehow made it more genuine. "Suyin, you drive me absolutely crazy in the best possible way. You challenge everything, argue with half my decisions, and refuse to accept any limitation I try to place on you. I wouldn't have it any other way. Will you marry me? Again, but for real this time?" Suyin laughed, pulling him up to standing. "Yes, you impossible man. Yes, I will marry you. Again and forever." Luke didn't bother with formality, just swept Lileen into his arms. "We're already planning a wedding, but I want to ask anyway. Lileen, you make every day better just by existing in it. Will you marry me with flowers and music and everyone watching?" "Yes," Lileen practically shouted, kissing him enthusiastically. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Elias approached Gia with his characteristic quiet intensity. He didn't kneel or make grand gestures, just took both her hands and spoke low enough that only she could hear clearly. Whatever he said made her eyes fill with tears and her face light up with joy. She nodded and he kissed her gently, sealing a promise that needed no audience to have weight. Then Silas turned to Maylene, his heart pounding with nerves he hadn't expected. They'd already committed to each other last night, had already chosen their future. But this felt different, formal, witnessed, a declaration rather than a private understanding. "Maylene," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You came here running from a nightmare. You stayed because you needed safety. But somewhere in the last 6 months, you became the person I want beside me for every challenge, every victory, every ordinary day in between. You make me better. You make this place better. You make everything better just by being in it." He reached for her hands. "Will you marry me? Not for protection or partnership or practical reasons, but because we choose each other?" Maylene's smile was brilliant and unguarded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, I will marry you. I choose you, Silas Carter, every day for all our days." The room erupted in celebration, laughter and tears and embraces. 8 people who'd started as desperate strangers now bound by choice and affection and shared experience. They spent the next month planning weddings that would declare to the whole territory that the Carter family was here to stay. Lilene coordinated with Sarah Webb in the women's reading circle, her enthusiasm infectious enough to overcome remaining prejudice. Maylene worked with Marcus Webb on supplies, negotiating trades that benefited both the ranch and the town. Gia designed decorations that would blend Chinese traditions with American customs. Suyin helped organize logistics with the efficiency of a military campaign. The day they chose was perfect, mid-May, when Montana was dressed in wildflowers and new grass, when the sky arced overhead in impossible blue, when the land itself seemed to celebrate renewal and growth. They held the ceremonies at the ranch, unable to fit everyone in the small church, and wanting the celebration rooted in the place that had become home. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, some genuinely supportive, some curious, some still uncertain about Chinese immigrants but willing to attend because the Carters were respected. 4 couples stood beneath an arch that Elias and Luke had built, decorated with flowers that Gia and Lilene had woven together, prairie roses and Chinese silk flowers, American wildflowers and traditional red fabric, a blending of cultures that represented the marriages themselves. Judge Morrison officiated, his formal legal language mixed with genuine warmth. When he asked if anyone had objections, Constance Hartford stood up, and tension rippled through the crowd. "I have something to say," she announced. Silas felt Maylene tense beside him, felt his brothers shift into protective stances. But before anyone could respond, Sarah Webb stood up as well. "So do I," Sarah said firmly. She turned to face Constance. "You can say whatever narrow-minded thing you're planning, or you can sit down and let these people celebrate marriages that are clearly built on more love and respect than half the unions in this territory. Your choice." Constance's mouth opened and closed. Around her, other people started standing. Marcus Webb, Sheriff Hayes, Tom Sullivan, and his wife, even some of the women from the reading circle. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to show that community acceptance wasn't universal, but was real. Finally, Constance sat down, her disapproval clear but her opposition defeated by sheer weight of contrary opinion. The ceremony continued, each couple speaking vows they'd written themselves. Rowan and Suyin promised to keep challenging each other, to never settle for easy when growth was possible, to build a partnership as fierce as Montana weather. Luke and Lilene vowed to choose joy, to face hard times with optimism, to fill their lives with laughter and children and hope. Elias and Gia committed to quiet strength, to healing each other's wounds, to creating beauty in a world that desperately needed it. And Silas and Maylene stood before their community and promised to choose each other every day, to build lives of purpose rather than just survival, to transform the contracts that brought them together into love that would sustain them through whatever the future held. When Judge Morrison pronounced them married, again and for real this time, if I understand correctly, the laughter that rippled through the crowd was warm and genuine. The celebration that followed lasted until stars came out. There was food enough to feed a small army, music provided by fiddles and guitars, and Lilene's surprisingly lovely singing voice, dancing that mixed American square dancing with elements of Chinese traditional movements that the sisters taught to anyone willing to learn. Children ran wild through the property, their laughter carrying on warm evening air. Couples danced or talked or simply enjoyed being together. Friends toasted the newlyweds with whiskey and cider, offering advice that ranged from genuinely helpful to outrageously inappropriate. Silas danced with Maylene as the sun set, holding her close while the world turned golden and soft around them. She wore a dress that combined American style with Chinese silk, her hair arranged with both flowers and traditional ornaments, every detail a declaration that she was claiming both heritages, both identities, refusing to choose between past and present. "Are you happy?" he asked her quietly, needing to hear the answer even though he could see it in her face. "I am more than happy," she replied. "I am free. I am home. I am loved. These are things I did not dare hope for when we fled San Francisco. These are things I thought were lost to me forever." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting firelight and starlight. "You gave me back my future, Silas. All of you did. I will spend my life being worthy of that gift." "You already are," Silas said simply, "just by being exactly who you are." As the evening wore on, guests began departing, heading back to their own homes and lives, leaving behind well wishes and promises to visit soon. The 8 newlyweds again, properly this time, gathered together one last time before couples dispersed to their private celebrations. "We did it," Luke said, grinning at everyone. "We actually built something real out of the craziest arrangement imaginable." "We built family," Rowan corrected, "which is all any of us really wanted to begin with." "We built home," Gia added softly. "We built freedom," Suyin said, her fierce pride evident. "We built future," Maylene finished, "for ourselves and for generations that will come after us. Children who will grow up knowing they belong, knowing they are wanted, knowing that love can bridge any gap if you are brave enough to try." They stood together under Montana's stars, 4 brothers and 4 sisters who'd started as strangers and become family through choice and courage and stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Later, much later, when privacy finally claimed couples to their separate rooms, Silas lay beside Maylene in the darkness and listened to her breathing slow into sleep. Through the walls, he could hear muffled laughter from Luke and Lilene's room, quiet conversation from Elias and Gia, the contented silence from Rowan and Suyin that spoke volumes without words. The ranch was full of people, of life, of love in all its complicated, beautiful forms. His father had built this place dreaming of generations to come, of family sprawling across the land, of legacy extending beyond a single lifetime. That dream had nearly died with his parents, had felt impossibly distant during the years when 4 brothers struggled to maintain what they couldn't quite fill with meaning. Now the dream was alive again, renewed and transformed. Different from what his father had imagined, better perhaps because it was built on choice rather than just blood, on love that had been tested and chosen to endure. Outside, the Montana wind blew gentle across land that stretched toward horizons too distant to see. Spring rain began falling softly, nourishing the gardens Maylene had planted, feeding the grass that would sustain their cattle through another year, washing clean a world that held both beauty and hardship in equal measure. Inside, the Carter Ranch house sheltered 8 souls who'd found each other across impossible distance and improbable circumstances, who'd built home from hope and determination, who'd transformed survival into thriving, contracts into commitment, strangers into family. The future stretched ahead uncertain and full of challenges that would come in their own time, but whatever those challenges brought, they would face them the way they'd faced everything else, together, stubborn, refusing to give up on each other or the life they'd chosen to build. 4 brothers and 4 sisters, 8 hearts beating in the darkness, 8 lives intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted or planned. But in the end, the best things were never planned. They were chosen, day after day, through the small accumulated decisions that transformed chance into destiny and strangers into forever. Silas pulled Maylene closer, felt her settle against him with complete trust, and closed his eyes knowing that morning would bring work and weather and whatever the frontier decided to throw at them next. But they would face it together, as partners, as family, as home. And that was more than enough. That was everything. The wind sang through the rafters like a lullaby. Rain whispered against the roof. and in the warm darkness of a ranch house that no longer knew loneliness. 8 people slept peacefully, their futures bright with promise, their pasts finally released, their present absolutely complete. Home had been found, family had been built, love had been chosen. And under the wide Montana sky, that was the only story that mattered anymore.